Hello, everyone, and welcome to the CBAA webinars brought to you with the support of our good friends at the Community Media Training Organisation. Tonight's session, 10 good governance tips for community radio boards and committees. But before we get into that, it's time to do a little bit of housekeeping. That housekeeping is in regards to, firstly, the 2018 CBAA conference happening from the 8th to the 10th of November at the Gold Coast Convention Centre. Be there or be square, or should I say, get your backside trackside. CBAA CEO John Bissett is going to be leading this evening's session. John, if you wouldn't mind getting the next category, and there it is, the 2018 CBAA Community Radio Awards. They are open now. They were originally due to close at midnight tonight, Wednesday, 27th of June. But I'm happy to let you know, you'll get this officially sent to you in an email tomorrow. But very happy to sort of let you know that before that we're going to have a week's extension on the awards, which is absolutely amazing. It'll give you an extra opportunity to get on in there and put in your awards. And just in case you've already submitted an entry, the awards platform allows for you to go back in and edit your content. So just in case you wanted to add a little bit more flavour there, put a bit of sauce on your award, the opportunity is yours. Next slide, please. So I'm going to be coughing a bit tonight. And as we said, 10 good governance tips for community radio boards and committees. Tonight's session. Our next webinar after this one will be ACMA Licence Renewal 101. Just going through all the ACMA licence renewals. There are quite a few stations whose licence is being renewed in the latter half of 2019. The ACMA will, of course, never like to be referred to as ACMA. The ACMA will, of course, ask that stations begin their renewal 12 months in advance. So hopefully this session next month will get people on the ball and they're ready to fill out those licence renewals, because they're a bit of a bugger of a thing to do. But if you know what you're doing and you've got that content there and evidence of how you're serving your local community, hopefully it'll make it a little bit easier for you. So it's 27th of June. Tonight's session is led by John, CBAA CEO. Thank you very much for being the person here in the hot seat tonight, John. I believe your microphone is on at the moment. So let's have a quick look at what we're going to be looking at tonight. And of course, people should feel free to start chatting whenever you can. In tonight's session, you will engage with basic concepts of good governance as a community broadcaster. We're presented with 10 tips that your station can implement now and have the opportunity to put forward questions in our brand new spiffy Q&A box. And you can also put forward your questions there in the webinar chat. John Hacking saying, please slow down. I can't do it, mate. I've set the webinar presentation for things to fade in at full speed. And also I've got a background in greyhound racing commentary. But I'll try this later. I promise you that our presenter for this evening, John Bissett, the CEO of the CBAA, will be a little bit slower than I. John, I think I should give it to you now, mate.
Thanks, Danny, and welcome everyone to tonight's webinar. Danny's given a bit of an overview, and thanks, Danny, for keeping, some of us have been on in the webinar for half an hour now. Thank you for keeping us occupied during that time. So today's session is really to tackle some of the questions in community radio governance. And Danny and I are regularly talking to the ACMA, and it's certainly one of their areas of concern, and probably one of the CBAA's areas of concern too, is the level of governance in the sector. And we're really putting an effort into trying to improve it across the board. Certainly there's some stations that are very good at governance. Certainly there are some other stations that could improve. And I'm really looking forward to the opportunity tonight to take you through 10 tips. Firstly, though, I just want to remind everyone that at our conference last year in November on the Gold Coast, we launched the Community Radio Station Health Check. And for those stations that haven't done that yet, I really encourage them to do so. Geordie from the CM2 and I presented at conference and talked about the health check and how you can use it to guide your station in the development of your governance processes. So it's pretty easy form to fill out. It's a checklist to fill out. You go online to that URL that's on the both in the chat box and also on the slide there, and complete it. And I really encourage boards or community radio station boards to do it collaboratively. So, if you can, put it on a laptop in front of you during a board meeting and go through it and have a conversation. It's framed in the way of questions. Do you do this? Do you do that? And then you answer it with a simple multiple choice option, really. I encourage you all to do it. What pops out at the end, once you've completed it, you'll get emailed a report that basically scores you in a whole lot of areas, but also gives you a plan of areas of priority that you can work on. So I'd really encourage you to go and do that. There's been some 40 or 50 stations that have completed it so far, and we're getting very good feedback around its usefulness. So tonight, as I said, we want to tackle some of the questions around governance and some of the very basic things, but I'm also looking forward to getting some questions coming through as we go through, and I'll answer some questions after each of the 10 tips. However, I think everyone should bear in mind that there's no one model that fits all. Governance in some ways is common sense, and in some ways stations have to decide what is the best way for them to operate. There's no categorically right answer. There are certainly some wrong things to do. So hopefully today we'll give you some points that you can take back to your committee boards and frame a discussion about the best way to go forward. A lot of people, when you mention governance, think it's just about policies and procedures, and that's definitely not the case. Governance is about a lot of things that tend to overlap. And I think what's really important is that, governance can be messy. It's not always possible to fit your processes or what you do into neat little packages without some overspill. And everything you do in one area impacts on another. So I think, bearing in mind today what we're talking about, governance covers across leadership. That's, a board's key role. It's about setting and stewarding the future and leading the organisation. It's about people, and I think people is what's often forgotten. It's about having the right people on the board and the right people in the right roles for the right reasons on the board. It's also about the right behaviours. It's about how the chair operates. It's about reviewing what you do and ensuring you have the right information to make decisions. And then I think it's the areas that people often think about what governance is, and that's the board structures and processes, and it's the policies and procedures. But I always say that leadership and people comes before some of those sorts of things, and they fit all very neatly together. Good governance is really important because it enables an organisation or a community radio station to have better organisational strategies and plans. It improves your effectiveness, makes sure you make prudent decisions in accordance with the law and those sorts of things. Means improved member and stakeholder engagement and communication flow, and increased likelihood and degree to which you actually deliver on what you're supposed to be doing. So some of these are pretty common sense tips. Some of them might challenge what some stations do, but I think that's the whole purpose of these sorts of sessions, is to get some ideas, take them back. Some will be relevant, some may not be, and seeing how you can use these tips to improve the way your station operates. So before I move on, don't forget the Station Health Check. Danny's put the link in the chat box. Go and do it straight after this, or go and do it at your next board meeting. So tip 1, really simple one, hold a planning day. Knowing which direction your station is going is absolutely vital. And when you're planning the way to go, consider all relevant stakeholders. So your stakeholders are and they might vary between stations, but they're certainly your listeners, they're certainly your presenters, they're certainly your other volunteers, they're your local council, they're your, local artists, local cultural groups. Consider them all when you're putting your strategic plan together and holding an annual planning day. After all, the key role of a board is determining and reviewing and maintaining the vision, purpose and values of the organisation. I think the planning process, it's critical, and in putting Danny mentioned earlier, your ACMA licence renewals, and they require a strategic plan or an operational plan, at least a budget when you're putting in your 5-year or more regular licence renewals. And the CBF also requires a strategic plan. So I suggest you all do it properly and make sure that it's actually a document that you use. I've so often seen a strategic plans that are 300 pages long or 50 pages long, and all they end up doing is sitting on your bookshelf or on the in a pile somewhere or other, or on a computer disk. So keep it short and simple. Keep it something that you're going to be able to use. And I think what's really important is the strategic planning process that you conduct on a planning day should help your organisation to look critically at your mission and answer lots of questions. And I think there's some key questions. Firstly, are you on the right track? Is what you're doing the right thing? So often stations don't change what they're doing because they've been doing it for 20 years. And I think that's the first fundamental question. Are you doing the right thing? Are you on the right track? Should you abandon anything, even if it's much loved, that you're doing that have outlived their usefulness? They're programming on your program grid that no longer are relevant. They're outside broadcasts you're doing that are no longer relevant. Are there other things you're doing? Has your community of interest shifted its focus? Now it's part of your a requirement to operate as a community radio station that you focus on your community of interest. Has it changed? Is your community changing? Should you be doing things a little bit differently? Is there enough capacity and commitment within the board, staff, volunteers, management, etc., presenters to achieve your goals? Do you need to find some new people, or do you have some real gaps that you need to get some expertise in to help you with? Do you have enough people? Do you have enough money? If you don't, then maybe do something more realistic that you can actually achieve, rather than planning for something that you just have no capacity to develop. And then I think back to where I started, what needs to change? Change has to occur. The world's changing every day, and change can be hard, but you really need to look at what you're doing. And I think, very importantly, strategic plan is a process. It's not a monument. It's not something you achieve at the end of the day. It's something that evolves. I was talking at a conference not so long ago with a whole lot of other not-for-profit organisations, not community radio stations, and one of the key things the panel I was on determined was, in the past you had 5-year strategic plans. Well, the planning cycle's much shorter these days. You're probably talking about, the things you used to try and do in 5 years, you now try and do in 1 year. So what's really important is you hold that planning day regularly, you review what's going on, are you doing the right things, and you keep evolving and keep changing. Danny's put some links up there. And no, unfortunately, my video's not working, John, so you can't see me talking. Maybe we'll work on that for next time. But Danny's put up some links to some CBAA resources that you might want to link on to help you with what you're doing. Okay, tip number 2. Minutes. Sounds really simple, but we know that this is actually something that's a lot of stations get wrong, and there's a lot of arguments about. And sometimes it's about very minor things. So firstly, I think board meetings more broadly, there's three really key things. That's good meeting papers. So, I said earlier, one of the things you need is information to make decisions. If you're going to be making decisions, you need good information to make that on. Good time management. I remember being on some committees in a few years ago where the meetings just dragged on and on and on and on, and I think we're probably all familiar with those sorts of meetings. Meetings really only need to be as long as they need to be to allow the necessary decisions to be made, and no longer. And I think that's really important. And then the third one, which links to that, is good chairing. The chair is the most critical person in that board meeting and responsible for ensuring that meeting papers are well structured. The meeting flows, everyone gets to have a say, and has an ample opportunity for doing so. So now more specifically about minutes. I'm often asked, oh God, what needs to be in the minutes? There's really two types of minutes. Minutes of a resolution, which is a pretty short lot of minutes, just really record the decision being made, and exclude a lot of narrative on the background of the resolution or the reasons behind them. And then there's minutes of narration. These are minutes often much more comprehensive, who said what, details of discussion, reasoning surrounding the decisions. A few tips though I would suggest. Neither's right or wrong, but I would suggest the balance is somewhere in the middle. You certainly don't need to record everything everyone said, but you need to have that background. So if you need to refer to them in a few years' time or in the future, there's a little bit of context. If the decisions are clear from a board paper or something you've prepared, you don't really need to record the reason in the minutes. However, if they differ from something you've done in advance, then there's probably more reason to include it. Don't forget to declare any personal interests. So if you're making a decision, if you're making a decision that involves a person, if you're buying something from someone's business who's on the board, then make sure that interest is declared. And if they exclude themselves from the meeting, which is often maybe good practice depending on the issue, make sure that's recorded in the minutes. Make sure you record any significant issues or concerns raised by the board and in the way which they were resolved. And again, any actions, make sure you record the actions. The other thing that's often asked is who can see the minutes? Well, minutes are generally confidential to the board. They're a record of the board meeting. There's no legal requirement that you need to make them public unless your constitution says so, and I would suggest that's probably not good practice for a constitution to say they should be made public. What's really important that board members can have frank conversations, and then those conversations can stay within the meeting and you move forward with a united front. Now that doesn't say you don't communicate board decisions, and I'll come to that at a bit of a later tip. So a couple of questions have come through before I move on. Can meetings be recorded as in audio? You can certainly, that's a decision a board can make. Final minutes have to be written. That's a requirement of all the requirements of the different fair tradings that you're with. So it has to be recorded. I would suggest you don't keep those recordings. Certainly once you've got minutes and they're signed, that's the final record of the meeting. So you should at that point delete those recordings. So another question here about change managers most difficult. Look, I think change is always difficult, and I'm not sure there's a particularly easy answer. It's really about good communication and discussion and a decision being made. And I think we'll talk a bit about behaviour a bit later, but I think one of the key challenges is you need to consult, but at some point a decision has to be made, and the board should be the board is the organisation responsible for making those decisions, and if the members aren't happy with those decisions, then at a later point in time they have an opportunity to elect the board. So the board should be able to get on and do their job. Why delete the audio? Because then you have to look. There's no definite reason or direction to delete the audio, but certainly you then have a set of minutes, which is everyone signed. You have another document. The set of minutes is the official record of the meeting. So therefore, you really have no reason to keep audio going forward. And I'm sure most lawyers out there would recommend deleting. I'm going to move on to tip 3. Communicate the board decisions. And I think I said just a few minutes ago, minutes aren't necessarily to distribute. They're an internal record for the board, a historical record for down the track. But you do need to communicate, and I think communicating board decisions are absolutely essential. And communicating them in a way that shows the board is the board is the authority at the station that makes those sorts of decisions, but that considers appropriate decisions, appropriate information in doing that. And not just communicates to members. I think there's a real question that stations need to consider about who are the stakeholders. There's clearly members, there's listeners, there's local organisations that are involved with, there's sponsors, there's people you owe money to, there's employees, there's government and their agencies, as in the ACMA. So in thinking about how you communicate board decisions, think about all your stakeholders, not just the board. And think about how you communicate. I think what's really essential is that the board communicates with one voice. You don't have one board member saying one thing and another one saying another. That's a sign of a poorly operating board when that happens. I sort of like to add here too, I mean, communicating the board decision, this sort of goes also with making sure the board has the right information. If you're looking at stakeholders and looking at what they want, then you really need to ask them. So, back to that planning day, make sure that when you're planning and considering, you actually ask those other stakeholders what they want from the organisation. You can do that through surveys, you can do that through focus groups, you can do that in other ways. And I think we've had webinars in the past and we'll have in the future around community engagement. Okay, tip 4. Review your constitution every few years. I'm amazed when I'm visiting community radio stations, and I think I've visited about 130 of them now since I started as CEO 5 years ago. How many of them have the same constitution that they had when they formed 40 or 20 or 30 or 10 years ago? Constitutions need to be updated to reflect station needs, and there's a link there to a resource that talks a little bit about that. So some of the key things in your constitution to check. Are your objects in there okay? Your objects in your constitution is actually what you are legally required to do as a community radio station. Are they correct? Think about, are you actually a charity or have DGR status? And we might talk about those at some other webinar. But if you're not, then your objects and your constitution needs, and you want to become a charity or obtain DGR status. And DGR status enables, for those that don't know, enables stations to get tax deductible donations. So you may need to change your constitution to enable you to become a DGR status organisation. Is your board correct? And we'll talk a little bit, some of the tips in the future, a little bit more about board structure. Are the members still the right members? Are there different categories of members? How do you manage that? And are you meeting ACMA requirements? I mean, ACMA, through the licence renewal process in recent years, has been asking stations to ensure that their membership is open, where applicable, rather than restricted to certain people, and that there's clauses in the constitution to enable people whose membership is rejected to appeal appropriately. I've got a question there about making your constitution available. I strongly would suggest that a constitution should be available to anyone that wants it. It should be on a website, should be on the station's website, freely available. In fact, it's if you're a charity, it would be on the ACNC or the Australian Charity and Not-for-Profit Commission's website. So yes, very strongly your constitution should be publicly available, easily available. It is a document that governs how you work. So I would say it's totally incorrect if a station is forbidding its members and potential members from reading the constitution. I would say about changing constitutions, so people often think it's just about the technical processes. You know, you need a special resolution, you need to give 21 days notice or whatever it is in your constitution. But I would say it's much more than that. It's actually about communication and people and making sure that those changes are understood and by all. So really look at your constitution, but think about the process and the communication around the changes you are trying to make as well. Tip 5. Ensure balance between board turnover and continuity. Boards want to have new members every few years, but you also don't want the whole board turning over all the time, because you need to sort of balance the knowledge that they have and and what they're doing. So I think it's really important. You know, a good operating board needs the right people with an appropriate mix of skills on the board. You need the right skills and experience. You need to consider diversity, and not just gender diversity, but you know, does the board reflect the community of interest that you're serving to some degree? And often that is a challenge for community radio stations, particularly where every member of the board is elected for a one-year term. You know, I'd really strongly suggest that stations move away from one-year terms and look at 2 or 3 year terms for board members. I think tip 6 sort of goes on for that. You know, one of the big risks a board has is when an entire board changes. Suddenly you lose all of that institutional knowledge. Suddenly you have all these new people that don't know what has been happening. So stagger your terms. You know, if your board consists of 8 people, maybe 4 of them are elected in 1 year and 4 the next. So the most can change at any one time is 4. Or if your board's 9, 3 1 year, 3 the next, 3 after. So everyone gets a 3-year term. Lessens the probability of everyone leaving at once. But it also means that there is always some change happening. If you have everyone up for a 3-year period, there's no change for 3 years, which is also not a very good solution. You also need to have an orderly succession plan. You know, the last thing you want is a really good president to leave or chairman to leave without you having thought about who your next chairperson would be. So stagger your terms. It's not something I see is very common in community radio, but it's certainly been something that most not-for-profit organisations are now implementing if they haven't already. Tip 7. Have term limits on office bearers. In fact, have term limits on all your members of your board. I missed that on the staggered terms, but one of the problems we certainly see is when someone or when boards don't change. So what's becoming very common and is certainly recommended as good practice is is having term limits. Different organisations think about how that could happen differently. Some say 8 years, some say 9, some say 12, but it's not good practice to have someone on a board for 20 years. So I think what I see a lot of organisations doing is having staggered terms, say 2-year terms. You can do 4 or 6 of those, something like that, and then you've got to step off for a year and then can be re-elected again after you've stepped off for that 1 year. Got a question here from Scott. Scott's at 4RPH in Brisbane, asking about documented succession plan for board members. Look, I think a succession plan is always good practice. Whether it's documented is really up to your board. Remembering elections are obviously based on members, but you certainly should have some sort of plan and at least be talking about it. What happens if your president gets a job overseas and has to move all of a sudden, or unfortunately gets hit by a bus or something like that? What are your plans if something goes wrong? So back to sort of the term limits on president and office bearers, also not something that's particularly common in community radio, but is something that's extremely common in not-for-profit organisations over the last 10 to 15 years. It forces change to your board. And new people in your board can inject new ideas and a fresh enthusiasm and excitement. So it's a really good thing to start implementing. Obviously, like staggered terms could require a change to your constitution, but it's a good thing to start talking about those sorts of changes. Okay, tip 8. Expect quality and timely financial reports. I was at an organisation, actually not a community radio station, a few weeks ago, talking to one of their board members who said, basically said, not quite a word for word, but basically said, I don't really worry about the finances of my organisation. We've got a treasurer who does that. And I think that's often a common thing that that board members consider because they have a treasurer. In fact, a lot of organisations, it's a bit different if you're a volunteer-only organisation, but a lot of organisations are going away from having a treasurer because what's really important is it's not just the treasurer that's responsible for the finances, it's the entire board. And the entire board has the right to see those accounts and reports at every board meeting, and they need to be quality reports, they need to be timely, they need to be accurate. So if you're a board member and you're not getting that, then it's something you need to discuss at a board meeting and get the problem fixed. It's probably the area of greatest personal risk for a board member is an organisation becoming insolvent. So you really need to have a look at that and ensure that the organisation is operating viably, finance, there's no fraud going on, that you're operating in accordance with your CBF grant terms, all those sorts of things that should be reported on and are really the responsibility of an entire board, not just the treasurer or the president. There's a question here which goes back to the previous question. A fear with limiting terms is that people might nominate for other positions so they can keep on a board. Is that where board rules, maybe a terms of reference document might be handy, limiting nominations to X number of roles? Look, I think that's an individual, Craig, that's an individual thing for a particular station. I certainly, you would frame that so that if you're on a board, you couldn't just shift to a different position. I have seen examples where a board had a term limit of 8 years, unless at that point you were elected as president, you could then serve an extra 2 years. That was recognising the fact that often presidents need a bit of experience before they step up. But I'm presuming you're meaning you might have someone on the board that's a treasurer who then steps across to vice president, or might be the person responsible for marketing, for example, and then steps across to chairing the program committee. I think you just need to write the constitution needs to be written so it prevents people shopping around like that. I mean, the whole purpose of term limits is so people can step off the board for a period of time and can then come back after a year, but it gives a break, which is, really good practice. Doesn't mean that person can't be involved in the organisation in another space. They could continue being a presenter, or they could volunteer in another way, but it just means they're not in the board in the decision-making role. There's a couple of other questions there. Tony, I'll address yours because it's relevant sort of to the similar thing I was talking about Craig's question there. What are your thoughts about appointed board members, board members that are not elected but appointed by other board members? I'm very much in favour of appointed board members on a couple of provisos. One, community radio stations are there to represent their communities. And obviously democracy is extremely important. So I would, I think one or two appointed directors is really good practice. Having a majority of appointed directors is not appropriate. Appointed directors do a number of things. For example, the board can identify that you need someone with a particular skill, whatever that may be. And a lot of people mention lawyers or accountants. I don't necessarily think that's the sort of thing you should be necessarily chasing, but there might be a skill, there might be, a connection to the local council, and by getting someone involved, that might help. So it enables you to target someone or people that are not necessarily someone that would stand for a board. I also think appointed positions address other issues, diversity issues, for example. There's some cultures that where it may limit standing for election, where you've got to stand in front of an AGM and potentially talk and tell people what you want to do, is for some cultures not the best way to be appointing someone. Or for young people, it may be not necessarily the appropriate person. Even introverts are not necessarily suited to an election process. So I think it's a very good model to employ, as long as it's limited to one or two board members. A question from Jeff: what do you do if no one wants the position? For example, marketing or it's disappeared off, whatever the next word is, disappeared off my screen. But look, it's always tricky, and maybe that's where the appointed directors come in. You go and target someone for one of those roles. I think one of the biggest challenges to all not-for-profit volunteer organisations going forward is the availability of volunteers. Volunteerism is changing significantly, and we need to look at new ways that people can participate. And often saying, hey, come and be the marketing person on the board, and you need to put in 15 hours a week to do that, is not going to attract people anymore. So it's a bit of a trick, and it's one, Jeff, I certainly don't have an answer to. And VP was that last word. Thanks. I think that it's it's a good question. Probably one of the challenges that there's no very clear answer to. So just before I went back to some of those questions, someone did ask, and it's gone off the screen, what constitutes quality financial reports. I think that's a really good question. I think you should be able to see a profit and loss statement and a budget, or profit and loss statement includes a budget that shows very clearly if you're operating within the budget that the board's previously set. I think you need to be able to see a balance sheet, so you know how much money you have in the bank, what your other assets are, whether you're trading insolvently, all those sorts of things. Finance is a difficult thing for a lot of small NFPs, a lot of people coming in onto those boards that don't have a lot of understanding about finance. And and at times we've run webinars about that, and I think we'll run some more webinars in the future. And the CMTO certainly runs some courses around financial reports and understanding them, those sort of those sort of things as well. Okay, tip 9. Avoid having an inner board. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I'm often told, oh, the executive decided that. Well, I'm not a big fan of executives, and there's a lot of organisations that are moving away from having executives because what they essentially do is have a small number of the board making decisions on behalf of the whole board and not including them all. So I think what's really important, that if you're going to have an executive, that the rest of the board knows exactly what it has authority to do, that it has a terms of reference, that its decisions are limited to certain things, and it's not a subset of the board that's there to make all the big decisions and just keep the rest of the board informed. Ultimately, the decisions that the executive making, the whole board has legal responsibilities for. So the decisions you're going to allow the executive to make, you need to make sure that if you're not a member of the executive but a member of the board, you are comfortable with them making, knowing that you could have some liability about that in the future. So have a think about executives and roles, or the role of the president. Make sure their role is clearly delineated. Can they be making decisions or telling people what to do? Or is their role just chairing a meeting and making collective decisions of the board? So question 10. Tip 10. Board size. I've jumped ahead a bit there. Board size. Research shows that the average ideal size is 7 to 9 board members. Now, why? The more people you have sitting around a table, the more people either don't participate because there's so many people around the table, or don't have an opportunity to have a conversation. I think 7 to 9 is really important when you actually want to debate things, have robust conversations, make sure everyone is having an opportunity to have a say. I remember when I first started working in not-for-profit organisations, my organisation had a board of 56. Extremely ludicrous, and there was probably only 3 or 4 people that actually did very much in that organisation. Fortunately, they changed pretty soon after that. But a lot of organisations are 12 or 13. Are all of them turning up to meetings? Make sure that if people don't turn up to meetings, they shouldn't be on the board. So the ideal is 7 to 9. Something to think about if you're changing your constitution. Etc. And as Chris Cooper has said in the question or a statement, there is perhaps too many board members leads to difficult group dynamics. Very much the case, but likewise, too small a board can mean the decision-making power is in too small a group. So it's about getting the balance right. And 10. I'm not saying 10 is wrong or that 6 is wrong. I'm just saying that 7 to 9 is sort of where research suggests is the ideal size to get that balance between. Group dynamics. There's always going to be someone sick or unable to come, so you don't want too few, so that if you have 6 and 2 are sick, you only have 4. Not really enough for a proper meeting. And a question there about, does that include officers? Yeah, that is the entire board. Not necessarily. When I say entire board, I would see that as the voting members of your board. You might have staff, if you have any attending board meetings, that might be in addition. But think about, if you have multiple extras, non-voting people attending meetings, they add to that group dynamic question. So, the CBAA board, for example, has 7 voting members, a women's and a youth rep, but also sitting around the table is myself and at least 1 other staff member. So that takes 7 or 8 board members to 12. That varies the dynamics to some degree. Nick from Alpine Radio said a good treasurer will give the board an analysis of the financial situation and not just the figures. Will point out if there are problems coming up and before they become big problems. Conversely, a good board will ask the treasurer difficult questions. Agree 100%. That's exactly what you want from a good treasurer. You want him to be giving you the good the right results, but then analysing it for you and telling you what to look for. But also you have a responsibility to look beyond what he's saying and see that what he's actually saying is correct. Okay, now some of you saw my sneaky bonus tip a minute ago. So I have a bonus one, yes, 11. And I think this is actually, in talking to a lot of stations, one of the really important issues. Danny and I were at the ACMA a couple of weeks ago talking about the number of complaints they're getting that mostly stem to be internal disputes, and internal disputes seem to be quite rife in this sector, and it's I think it's something that's a real challenge for many community radio stations out there. And that goes to having, you need to have the right processes and procedures and those sorts of things. But, I think it's impossible to overstate the importance of behaviour in creating a really good board. And it's important to note that the leaders of an organisation, i.e. the board, are responsible for setting the behavioural expectations that align with the vision of the organisation. And those behaviours need to be driven and modelled by the board, and if you have staff, particularly the senior staff, and especially the chair, fulfilling a crucial role in setting the organisation on the right path. So there's a report, it's actually out of the UK, but I think it's very important. It's called The Behavioural Drivers of Board Effectiveness, and I thought I might just go through some of these because I think this is where I see, Danny might agree with me. He's on the front line every day talking to community radio stations, but this is certainly one area where the sector falls down. A lot of stations in the sector fall down. There's also a lot of good stations. So if your station is operating really harmoniously and well, then that's absolutely fantastic. But I think there's 7 areas that I sort of wanted to talk about briefly. So it all starts and ends with the chair. The chair is the single biggest determinant of a board's, or the president, the single biggest determinant of a board's effectiveness. He or she has the primary role in determining its focus, sets the tone of discussions, and ensures everyone has a say. So the chair, one of the really critical attributes of a chair is that ability to, facilitate meetings, get people behaving correctly, those sort of things. Probably more important than knowledge of community radio or those sorts of things. Not saying that's not important, but it's a really important attribute. If you've got staff, and some stations do, and the vast majority don't, but if you do have staff, they must engage constructively with the board. And I'd encourage, I certainly see stations that exclude the staff from board meetings, but if you have a station manager, I certainly say they should be involved. That they understand a lot of the day-to-day operations, and it's a really important role to bring. But they also, they have a lot of they're a great source of experience and insight to be leveraged, not a nuisance to be managed. So likewise, though, if the staff member have the wrong attitude, then there's a problem. Thirdly, balance on the board is a key. Effective governance requires balance on the board. So if there is one person that dominates or 2 people that dominate, that's not a good thing. Or if the president or the station manager is dominating, also not a good thing. It needs to have balance, and there needs to be conversation, and everyone needs to really see themselves as equals. Being a great board member is as much about character as competence. Having the right skills around the table is necessary, of course, but not sufficient condition for board effectiveness. It's equally important that board members have the necessary character for the role. So we need people to be able to listen to what other board members are saying and take on what they're saying and consider what's going on. We need board members that are able to accept that the decision the board as a whole makes is not what they wanted, but that they will go along and support the board in that decision making and not go and undermine the board. Those sort of behaviours are not acceptable and shouldn't be happening out there. The board needs to be designed and managed as a team. It means you need to be focused on a common purpose. You need to have the right size. That goes back to that group dynamics. You need to have mutual respect and commitment. You need to have the right diversity. If you're all the same type of person, all from the same background, that's results in groupthink. Obviously, not a good thing. And you need to invest in that team building. And that's one of the real important things about board meetings is you're coming together to spend time with each other and get to know each other, and that becomes really important. The best boards make skillful use of a range of safety valves. So you do have opportunities to talk about each other, well, not each other, but about how the board is functioning as a whole. You talk about problems that are inhibiting your work. You undertake conversations about the effectiveness of the board. And you anticipate and manage red flag issues. So every good board, every good organisation can have a board that goes off the rails from time to time. The best chairs and the best board directors or committee members are alert to the potential dangers and things to look out for. And I think there's really 3 really key red flags. The influence of power and success. What you've got to be very careful of if you have a person in a particular role for many, many, many years. They'll often start in that role with a balanced outlook, but over time become progressively less tolerant of challenge and less effective at taking advice. So it's really about getting that balance right and keeping a check on any one individual on a board having too much power. Boards often fall into or have a risk of falling into the trap of not stress testing their thinking and anticipating changes. So you've been doing something for many, many years. You don't think anything might go wrong. So I sort of mentioned before, you become a victim of groupthink because you don't actually provide the necessary challenge. Nick from Alpine Radio mentioned challenging, asking the treasurer difficult questions. Well, if you don't ask difficult questions, that's where you can get yourself into trouble. And then, of course, the drama of succession events. So your station manager suddenly leaves because someone's sick, or your president decides to leave. And suddenly you have this turmoil. Well, people jockey for position to try and get into a role. So you need to think about those and how you make those happen. Danny's put up a few little links there to some of our resources on board culture and ethics. But I think what's really key to me is this ensuring the right behaviours is really key, and it's the board that needs to lead from the front. And when someone comes onto the board, you need to set those expectations. Craig Craig Wright in the panel says that personal relationships really need a robust conflict of interest policy. I agree. I think there's a lot of this comes to process, but it also comes to the interaction of how things work. And in small organisations, there's going to be. You make a mention of someone on the board and their spouse being a bookkeeper. Well, that happens in small organisations, in small towns, or in. But it's about ensuring that doesn't create a problem, that there's a right delineation of roles, there's the right people checking it, those sorts of things. And I think in all, it's about conversation and talking, and you're always going to have disagreements, but it's about resolving those in an appropriate way, and in a way that is done professionally and properly. So I said a little bit earlier, ultimately a board is elected or appointed to do a job, and that is to lead the organisation. So if the members aren't happy, they have processes in the Constitution to change the board, and you should respect those processes and do that. But whilst the board's in a role, they need to get on and be allowed to get on and do the job. So that was my bonus tip. I
There you
can
go.
take some more questions. I'll flick over to you, Danny, but just before I do flick back to Danny, just like to remind everyone to do the community radio health check. Danny will put up the link again in the box, but it's a really valuable toolkit to go through and check how your station's actually doing in a good governance sense.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that, John. That was fantastic. There was a couple of questions that came into the instant message chat box when we're on point number 3 about board meeting minutes. I think you addressed some of those. And one of them was can the minutes be passed on to members? And it's obvious that we would encourage people at stations to be open and transparent with their meeting minutes. So hopefully that one's there. John Hacking had an interesting question. Are the minutes of previous boards open to the current board?
Look, good question, and yes, they should be. The minutes of previous meetings are the record of those minutes, so of those meetings. So yes, they are definitely open to new board members. Danny just mentioned open, transparent. I don't so much agree that minutes of meetings should be available to the general public or to even members, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't be open, transparent, and talk about what they need to know. Sometimes, boards need to discuss personnel issues or discuss financial issues or discuss commercial and confidence issues. They should be recorded in minutes, and therefore, and it's not necessarily appropriate to make those minutes public, but it is appropriate to ensure that applicable decisions are communicated to the stakeholders that need to know about them. So, they're my points, but certainly as per old minutes, they should be available in a minute book that's available to the new board or to board members, yes.
Some good discussion going on there in the instant message box about the importance of having some separation between board and management of the station. It would be folly to suggest that there's not some organisations where the station manager is also the board president. I think in those sort of situations, it's because there's just not enough people there on the ground, different people in those roles, but certainly if you can keep that separate, that would be the best thing for the organisation.
Yeah, and Danny, I'll add a little bit to that too. I think often the delineation between board member and staff is one of the areas that organisations go wrong, big and small organisations. What's really important, there's a clear delineation between roles. The president or chairperson should never be the station manager. That's a critical area that there should be a difference. That doesn't mean, the station manager should certainly, in my view, attend board meetings, though there might be periods where you have brief interludes without them, but probably a topic for another day. But I think it's really important that there is a separation of roles between the chair or president and the station manager.
All right, and now would I be correct in assuming that all the questions in the Q&A have been answered? Because I was sort of hitting click, they were answered, but then I found out that once I'd done that, people weren't able to view them. I was still able to view them, but
there's a few.
There's one from Annette. How do you encourage board members to be active?
Look, and that's a good question. I think you just need to encourage them, and if they're not going to be active, they shouldn't really be on the board. I think that's one of those behavioural things. You want board members that are active, and if they're not going to be, you ask them to stand down. And I think that's one of those areas where you need to have that clear delineation. There's another one here from Jeff about, can members attend board meetings and ask questions, or should be at a different meeting? My view is a board meeting or a committee meeting is for the committee or the board. It's not there for members. That doesn't mean you don't have general meetings or special general meetings or annual meetings for for broader members where the board answers questions. But the reason you have a board is it's elected to run the organisation, and they should be allowed to get on and run the organisation. So I would certainly suggest a different meeting. That doesn't mean the different meeting can't be on the same night. It could be, but I'd certainly separate those. A board needs, as I said this before, needs to be able to have confidential conversations about things that are going on, whether that's about staffing matters or whether that's about various things, and that's totally appropriate and correct. Craig Wright has asked, is there a thing as board fatigue, meetings too long, meetings too controlled, paperwork overload, even relationship management? I've certainly been on board where it's been very fatiguing years. I said right at the beginning, meetings, should only be as long as they absolutely need to be. Too much paperwork, agree. Keep the paper as, there's no right or wrong, but keep it to an extent that you can actually read before the meeting what you need to read. You don't have 300 pages that you have to prepare on a weekly basis. As for meetings being controlled, well, to a degree that's up to the how a meeting is run is to some degree up to the chair of the board. But as a board member, you certainly have a right to ask questions, and my expectation would be that you ask those questions and you challenge people, and that's in a constructive way. I think that's really important. And as someone that's anonymous there says the chair is the greatest single determinant, and they are. The chair is the person facilitating that meeting. They need to let everyone have a say. They need to and not just let everyone have a say, but encourage everyone to have a say around that board table.
Excellent. Hopefully, Michelle, you asked for clarification on that point, and hopefully what John's just said then provided said clarification. I've noticed that the most frequent comment coming in the last little while has been people saying, thanks very much, we have to go. So I'm going to take that as a sign that it's time to call it quits for this evening. Thank you very much to everyone who attended this evening's webinar. Don't forget, our next one is in regards to ACMA Licence Renewal 101 on Wednesday, 25th of July. That'll be at 6:30 p.m. Thanks very much to all the early arrivals. You don't have to stay up until midnight doing your applications for the 2018 CBAA Community Radio Awards, but you've only got 7 days, so be sure to get busy. On behalf of Geordie over there at the Community Media Training Organisation and all of my wonderful colleagues here at the Community Broadcasting Association of Australia, we thank you very much for your attendance this evening, and we look forward to seeing you at another CBAA webinar, brought to you with the support of the CMTO real soon. Have a great night. Catch ya.